Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasegawa, and this is episode 159. Today's guest is Abbie Kiefer. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm pleased to welcome poet Abbie Kiefer to the show. Abbie Kiefer is the author of Certain Shelter, published by June Road Press in 2024, and the chapbook Brief Histories, published by Whittle Micropress in 2024. Her work is forthcoming or has appeared in Coppernickel, Gulf Coast, Pleiades, Plowshares, Prairie Schooner, The Southern Review, and other places. She is a poetry editor for the Adroit Journal and lives in New Hampshire. Find her online at abbykieferpoet.com. So, by an interesting happenstance, I read Abbie's debut collection, Certain Shelter, shortly after the election. And the reason that felt, coincidental or meaningful or resonant or something, is that the poems in this collection have a lot to do with grief, and particularly about what happens in the aftermath of grief. And they have a lot to do with change and with moving into an unknown future. And, well, I don't know about you, but that really spoke to a lot of how I was feeling just at that time. Honestly, it speaks to how I'm feeling now, too. So you can understand why I'd be pleased to get the chance to talk to Abbie about her book. I've put some links in the show notes to purchase your own copies of Certain Shelter, either directly from the publisher or from the bookstore Print in Portland, Maine. As always, though, if there is an independent bookstore in your community, I highly recommend putting in an order there. For folks in New England, Abbie has a reading coming up at the South Portland Public Library in South Portland, Maine. That will be at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, March 25th. I've put a link in the show notes to Abbie's events page on her website, where you can find information on all her upcoming readings. Finally, Abbie was kind enough to contribute a reading to our bonus audio archive. Patreon subscribers at the $2 level will be able to hear her read her poem, I've Learned to Accept. You can subscribe at patreon.com/likewisemedia and get access to the full bonus audio archive, which includes readings from past guests, including Ada Limon, Nicole Chung, David Naiman, Liz Lenz, and many more. And your support goes a long way towards making this podcast possible. Once again, that's patreon.com/likewisemedia. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Abbie Kiefer. There's something about this collection of poems that hit me kind of exactly at the right moment. You know, I read it for the first time in November, and it was at a time when I was thinking a lot about both grief and aftermath. And I think that there was something kind of serendipitous about having this collection come into my my reading right at that moment. So I'm pleased that we're getting a chance to talk about it, and thank you for that. I was hoping we could start with reading.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
This is called On MASH, Hawkeye Gets Mail from Crabapple Cove. Back home in Maine, he learns. The sardine cannery burned. Had it been real, the fire, the cannery, Crabapple Cove, half the women in town would have been out of work. In the episode, Radar gets mail too, a soundless black and white reel in which the actor who plays Radar also plays his mother. A small gag. But in the parting frames, she waves to the camera, mouthing, "I miss you," to her boy at war. And my eyes surprise me. They slosh onto the ratty towel I'm folding. Radar was my mom's favorite. End of the day, she'd sometimes watch reruns. To my disappointment, without me. A grown-up show, she said, probably not wanting to explain Houlihan as Hot Lips or why field hospitals exist and how they can also be places for jokes. Jokes backed by jarring laugh track, except for surgery scenes. Then it's Hawkeye, big eyes above white mask, deadpanning into quiet over someone's open and attenuated body, and the home viewer can laugh or not. Have you heard that story about laugh tracks? That they were all recorded in the 1950s? So the laughter you hear over modern sitcoms comes from people who are almost certainly dead. It's not true, though MASH is old enough that many of its laugh trackers are likely no longer living. Same for the viewers who laughed at home. I know of at least one. Alan Alda, Hawkeye, is now 88 and making a weekly podcast. A New Yorker profile calls him gentle, warm, the platonic ideal of nice dad. We never stop wanting parents, wanting home. When part of Hawkeye's home burns, he cracks a joke. Cue the laughs. Then there's Radar, so clever, finding a way to mother himself.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I'm always really interested because I always ask the guests to pick what poem they're going to read. When I talk with a poet, I always ask them to pick what poem they're going to read to start us off. And I'm always so interested to see which one they pick, especially when it winds up not being the first poem in the collection. This one is fifth or sixth, I think, something like that. There's a bunch of things about this poem that I kind of wanted to get into. First is that this is one of 10 poems in the collection that has this title format where it's on and then the name of a television show, and that the poem is in some way about that television show, right? Mm-hmm. And there's something about the use of pop culture and in particular television as sort of a marker that I'm really interested in. And I have some thoughts about it, but I guess I wanted to just ask you first what it is about television in particular, because this runs throughout the collection, these different television programs. Some of them are old like MASH, and some of them are more contemporary like the Great British Bake Off. Some of them are very long running like Jeopardy. And I'm wondering why for you it was important to use television as this sort of touch point throughout the collection.
Yeah, so it actually started with a poem that didn't make it into the collection. It was about Grey's Anatomy. So after my mom had died, I was finding I just wasn't functioning that well. And there weren't a lot of things I could do, but like one of them was I could run on the treadmill. Like that felt okay to like use my body in a way that could be tired at the end. And then I could watch what I consider to be like junk TV. So I could do those two things. And I remember one day being on the treadmill, watching Grey's Anatomy, and there was this scene of a mother and daughter, and the mother was dying. And it was so lovely. It was this bright, clean room, and the mother and daughter were like laughing together until the end. And I just felt like that is not the truth. That's not how it goes. Yeah. And so it got me thinking about how we use TV in different ways. So for me at that point, some of it was just a way to pass time while I was grieving until I could, in my mind, get through it, get to being a more functioning person. Sometimes I think TV is a way we're trying to prepare ourselves for situations we haven't been in. So like with this MASH poem, or there's one about The Wonder Years, which is a show I feel really nostalgic about. I felt like when I watched The Wonder Years as a kid, I was looking at an adult looking back on his own childhood and kind of narrating what he was thinking and what his childhood meant to him. And I was thinking, oh, is this how I'm going to feel about my own childhood when I'm an adult? Am I going to look back on this, or is this the way I'm going to experience it? And so I think sometimes we can use TV as a kind of art to like reflect on where we are and prepare for where we might be going. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, one of the things that I immediately thought of, in particular shows like MASH or The Wonder Years or Jeopardy. I didn't grow up watching MASH, but it was something that I was always aware of as like something that grown-ups liked to watch.
Yeah.
But I did watch The Wonder Years. And when I watched The Wonder Years, I watched it with my mom, as the speaker of that poem also watches it with her mom. I'm going to probably end up conflating the poet and the speaker from time to time, and I hope that's okay.
Oh, yeah, it happens to all of us.
Okay. But how television, certainly for people of our generation, I think that we're pretty close to the same age. I'm going to be 46 this summer, so I think we're close-ish.
Yep, I'm 43.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that there is something about people that are of our generation where television was kind of a communal thing. It was kind of a family thing. I think now it's often more of a solitary thing, especially now that we have small screens that you can carry around to different rooms. I know with my own kids, a lot of times they want to watch stuff in their own rooms by themselves. But this sort of shared experience and how that forms sort of a backbone of memory is something that was very present to me in not all of these television poems, but in certainly in many of them. So that was, how does that strike you?
I had not thought about that, but yes, I think you're right. Because I'm thinking about that Wonder Years poem, and it's not just about the television show. It's about the kids watching the show and the mother coming through and making comments on it. It wasn't her favorite, but she still had opinions on it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was how the whole family processes this show together. It's the family watching it, thinking about the losses that are represented in the show and how they're going to respond to loss in their own lives. So yeah, I think that's really smart. I wish I'd thought of that for myself, but I think you're right.
Well, I think too that there is so much in this collection that is about not necessarily nostalgia, but definitely about memory. And this poem that you read has this thing that is actually kind of similar to what you were saying about the Wonder Years. The show The Wonder Years has this sort of layered sense of time, right? Where you are aware that what you're watching is the narrator's memory, right? And this poem, this MASH poem, has a similar thing to it, this sort of layering of memory, right? Because we see at the beginning that the speaker is watching an episode of MASH and becoming surprisingly emotional about it. But then we move backwards in time to the mother's favorite character. And then we also get this sort of view of how these things exist sort of frozen in time. And there's something about that layering of time and memory that feels very relevant to, one, just the experience of life, and certainly something that's sharper when you're dealing with grief and loss, but also that really does seem to run through the collection as a whole. And I guess I wanted to see how that struck you.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was thinking too about the layering of memory, how that happens for us when we're in grief. And my experience was that grief kept surprising me in strange ways, and it came on in ways I wouldn't have expected. So a TV show could trigger grief, or there's a poem about getting mail and that triggers grief. So I think when you're experiencing loss and when you're trying to just keep going with everyday things like everyone needs to, that layering feels more present because the memory is so much on your mind.
Yeah. I mentioned another one of the TV poems is about Bake Off. And that actually also had an interesting thing about time in it that I think this one is doing something similar. But there's a line in that Bake Off poem, which let me just find it here. It's an old episode, Each Time I Watch, Ian Goes Home. And how there's something about you can come back to this and watch it happening over and over and over again. It always unfolds the same way. That is a little bit like memory, but here it feels less like memory and almost more like time travel. Mm. And I wonder, one, if that is, maybe something about the difference between memory and time travel, but also, and I kind of wonder if a poem works like that as well, especially because, when we write a poem and then publish it, that's where it is. It's in that form now. I mean, some people do end up revising their poems after publication, especially if they're going to be published in a magazine first and then maybe be a little different when it gets collected. But more or less, the poem becomes some sort of artifact that is placed in a moment in time. And I wonder whether revisiting that poem, what that does for us. I mean, this is a little outside of like what the poems are doing in themselves, but there's something about the experience of reading the poem that kind of feels like that as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of like articulating that feeling of watching the show, knowing, how it's going to end. And there's still a little piece of you that kind of wants it to be different. You don't want the guy to have to throw his baked Alaska in the trash can because it's sad.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of juxtaposition. You're watching this show for comfort. You're revisiting this experience for comfort. And yet you also know there's something uncomfortable about it. A little piece of you hoping that it doesn't happen. I think thinking about time travel and how when we're experiencing a piece of art, like you talked about, when we go back to a poem, what does that mean? I mean, we always bring something a little different to it also, right? Like you live, you gain experience. A poem's always going to read a little differently to you. I don't know. What's your experience with that, with revisiting any kind of art? Do you feel like you always bring something different to it?
Well, especially when I'm revisiting my own work, it can be very jarring, But I'm thinking about, there's something about this idea of time travel where, there's different kinds of time travel stories. I read a lot of science fiction and in some time travel stories, you can change the future and change the past, and in some you can't, right? And there's something about this idea of going back to a past moment and knowing how it's going to play out and kind of wanting it to not play out that way, but then it does. That there is something about that, especially with my own photographs or poetry, that are often they're rooted in big feelings, let's say, and they're rooted in big feelings that maybe I don't have anymore. It's sort of a strange experience to walk around in those feelings again. Actually, there's actually, I don't mean to be talking about my own work in the interview where we're supposed to be talking about yours.
No, I'm interested.
Well, I did a series of photographs once that was about this feeling of not being able to go home anymore. And it was something I ended up thinking about a lot as I was reading and rereading this collection, the ways in which these spaces kind of change over time, and how, this feeling that you have that this is a place that really left its mark on you. But in some ways, like the place doesn't actually remember you after you leave. And how that can be really difficult when you try to go back to it and walk around in those spaces and you find that they're different and that you're different. I was thinking about that a lot as I was reading this collection, because there is so much about how things decay and then how things are reborn, which is ultimately about the process of changing these spaces, and how that can be something that is vital, or revitalizing is a word that comes up a lot in this collection, but how it's also, there's a pain to that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So where I grew up in Maine, there were a lot of mills that were either closed and had been for a long time, or were in the process of closing. And I remember as a kid feeling a sadness about that and not being able to articulate why, but it was a very present feeling. And one that followed me through adulthood. I still look at mill buildings and feel sadness. And when I started working on these poems and thinking through that, because some of the book deals with the loss of a parent, but some of it deals with a declining hometown and how you deal with that loss. I think what I couldn't articulate for myself as a kid was that I recognized that these mill buildings had at one point been really central to the towns they were in. So like geographically central, they were built on the water source, the river. So they were in the center of the land, but they were also economically central. Lots of people either worked there or worked in businesses that supported the mill. And at the time they were built, I imagine everyone looked at these massive buildings and thought, this is the way things will always be, right? This is always the way we'll make paper, or this is always the way we'll make textiles or shoes, and nothing will change. And clearly, me looking at it in the 80s and 90s, it's clear to me something has changed. And so that idea of, for me, those buildings, I think now looking back on it, represented an acknowledgement of things will change whether we want them to or not. And so when you were talking about decay and rebirth and change, I think that's all wrapped up in how I looked at some of those buildings. It's not something you have a lot of control over, and you have to accept it, just like loss of someone you love. Ephemerality is central to the human experience, and it's very sad sometimes, but it's also unavoidable. And so we have to figure out how we live with that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about how this collection is constructed and how, in my memory, because there were several months in between me reading it the first time and then me reading it the second time. And the way that I had sort of built it in my head, I unfortunately have a terrible memory for the details of books. And so I have to take extensive notes if I want to be able to talk about them in any kind of cogent manner. But I will end up remembering something about a feeling in between. And the thing that I had really thought about and taken away from it was this juxtaposition between the loss of a mother to illness, and then how that is juxtaposed with the decay and revitalization of this mill town in Maine, and how the one becomes a metaphor for the other. But actually, the moment of loss and the illness doesn't take up that much of the collection. It mostly happens just in the first section, and in the first, not even the whole first section, kind of at the beginning of the first section. And most of what comes after, it's not that isn't present, because there is mention of it here and there throughout the rest of the collection. But it's not really, in some ways, about the loss itself. Rather, it's about what happens after that. At least that's my reading of it. How does that feel to you?
Yeah, I think that's right. So when thinking about the title of this book, this is maybe the third title
I actually wanted to ask you about the title.
Yeah. So when I was trying to encapsulate what the book was about, because, that feels like a lot of pressure, but you need a title to be like marketable, rememberable, spellable. There's like a lot to put on a title, but
I find titling very stressful.
Me too. But so this one, like you said, I arrived at the same point, saying a lot of this is about how we deal with loss. And so for me, the title, Certain Shelter, is saying we can find sources of solace amid loss. There can be shelter for us. And the fact that modifier, certain, can mean two things, I think is useful. So certain can mean sure, like you can count on it. Or it can mean certain as in particular, meaning a particular kind of shelter. So I think that's what we have to acknowledge in the wake of loss, is that sometimes we feel like we're fully sheltered, and then sometimes we're going to feel like it's an imperfect form of solace, but it's still solace. And the work we do is figuring out how we keep going, knowing that we're not always going to be perfectly sheltered.
Yeah. I had, like I said, I've been meaning to ask you about the title, especially because that phrase, the exact phrase, doesn't appear anywhere in the book. There are things that are close. There are points when shelter is mentioned, like, for example, in I've Learned to Accept, there's a line about each necessary shelter meant to be left, which is talking about sparrows making their nests in these sort of temporary locations and staying only for a short time. There is a line that is ground that shakes can also shelter, can give certain solace if you insist, which to me, that was sort of the closest to the title. And that dual meaning of certain was something that I was really thinking a lot about, especially in the context of that particular line. There's another line that comes, I think, at the beginning of the poem, I'm So Very Tired, which is towards the end of the collection, where the line is, can I say that here in this poem about being less melancholy because it is solace to say it plainly. And that was another thing about like this idea of solace or shelter and how we achieve that was something that, I don't know, I feel like there's something that is being reached for towards that throughout the collection. Also, just as, I don't know if this is a tangent, but the idea of saying something plainly in a poem is really interesting to me.
Oh yeah, say more about that.
I think a lot of times we imagine poetry to be something, say truth but say it slant, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, there's a lot of times when I have no clue what a poem is saying. Like when I try to read Ashbery, there's something that I can find pleasurable about it, but I really don't know what those poems are trying to say at all most of the time, But this idea of saying something plainly in a poem, many of the poets that I admire quite a bit are ones who say things in a way that feels a little more plain. I think about somebody like Ada Limon, for example. A lot of her poems, I feel like they say things very clearly and accessibly, and without, not that there isn't like a music and a rhythm to it or even an incantatory quality, but just that it's kind of straightforward, Mm-hmm. And there's something that's kind of, I don't know. It's not that I dislike a poem that can be like highly lyrical and sort of oblique, because sometimes that's the only way to get at the experience you want. But I think that there's something about saying something straight that can have a real power to it. I've been going on and on here.
No, it's interesting. I agree. So that poem that you're mentioning where the speaker wants to say it plainly, that was one of the last poems to be written for the collection. And it came about because I'd had someone read the manuscript who said, we never really hear the speaker's rage about losing her mother. And I realized part of that. So I am, for better or worse, a taciturn New Englander, and we're just kind of a reserved people. And so I recognized what this reader was saying. And so I wrote a poem that felt like it said more plainly the rage part of loss, or just the devastation of loss. And then I got thinking about it, and I wanted to also say plainly the other side of that, which was, even when you experience loss, beauty continues and beautiful things find you. And this is, now verging on sentimental, but I think if I'll say it plainly here, I guess, is loss can be so overwhelming. It's such a comfort to find things amid that loss that are beautiful or comforting or reassuring to you. And so, yeah, if someone was experiencing their own loss, I wanted to plainly say there can be comfort too.
Yeah. And I think that is something that this collection is sort of reaching towards. It's interesting to me how it ends. There's something too about a lot of the poems in this collection. So there's 47 poems, and of those, 13 of them, they appear to be prose poems. It's a little hard to say sometimes when you see a big block of justified text, whether it's intended to be a prose poem or whether those are actually lines sometimes. But notably, all of the poems that are titled A Brief History of Something, right, are all in that form. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that feels very straightforward as well. And the fact that those poems are being labeled as a history and being presented in that prose poem kind of style, and then taking this idea of saying something plainly, but how even when you say something plainly, you can be saying more than one thing at the same time. I don't know. I'm a little unformed in how, that's not really a question, but does that sort of spark anything for you?
Yeah. I was talking to someone not too long ago who's had started in poetry and then moved into novel writing, became a novelist. And I was saying, I thought sometime I would like to be a novelist, but it feels too overwhelming for me. It's like a whole novel is too much to manage at once. And that part of why poetry appeals to me is I feel like I can never fully get my arms around anything. But when I was writing these poems in this brief history series, I could say something very short and true. And it felt like a satisfaction to be able to acknowledge to myself, like, I can never get at the whole story of anything, but I can say something that is brief and true and have done good work and let that be its own statement.
So I wanted to, we're getting close to the end of this segment, and I wanted to wrap up by talking about the last poem, particularly because of the way that the title of this poem, which is Certainty, does echo the title of the collection. And because of the way that, as we move through this collection, there is so much that feels uncertain, right? Like the future is kind of an unknown territory in so many ways. And a lot of what we're doing in these poems feels like moving into the future, right? And what does that look like? How do we build it? In particular, once we move out of the first section and then we start encountering the speaker's children, and how we are building something that comes out of what we came from, but something that's new. But still, there's not a lot of certainty there. And so the fact that this poem is called Certainty is really interesting to me, to have that be the final thing, that the last sort of statement that you are making in this collection is with a nod towards something being certain. But then what the poem is actually depicting is this sort of moment of youth, of creating a bonfire in the neighbor's yard. It seems like a bunch of young people creating a bonfire, doing this using things that once had a purpose, like pallets and bar stools, and that are now just going up in flames, but also how that is something that's creating a certain amount of joy. And then there's a moment of nostalgia here where the speaker and her partner are remembering being that young. There's a reach here towards something, but it's a little, at least to me, there's a little bit of ambiguity, which is something, I know you read the little review that I put on Goodreads, which is, there was something there as well where I said something like that that the collection is reaching towards something that I'm not sure exactly how to articulate, and I'm not sure that the collection knows how to articulate, but that kind of feels okay. But calling the last poem Certainty feels like a statement, Where do you want to go with this?
So I think that when you say the collection doesn't quite know what it's reaching toward either, I think that's right. So the way I looked at a lot of this was, I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I might not have the answer, and that's going to be okay. And the reader might not have the answer, and that's going to be okay too. So this particular poem, I think I have a tendency to want to think through worst case scenarios because I want to be prepared for everything. I want certainty. I want to know. And if I can't be certain, the next best thing I can do is be prepared for any eventuality. And the older I've gotten and the more I've done this, the more I've come to see it as a real waste of energy. And yet I can't quite stop doing it. So in this poem, the one image that does feel certain is at the end when the kids are feeding the bonfire. The branches are going to go up. That's certain. They get fed into the fire. They're going to burn and no longer exist. And so that's a certainty we have in life, right? Things, plants, animals, people, things die. And do you want to live your life geared toward that certainty? Does that feel comforting? Because sometimes I have been in a place where, at least temporarily, it feels comforting to say, well, okay, these are the certainties I have, and I'm going to think in worst case scenarios, and at least I'm prepared for it. And when you mentioned that there is joy in the poem, there's a joy of the kids making a bonfire, because that's fun. There's a joy of the speaker and her partner, like being outside, enjoying the fire from a distance, thinking about the last of the fireflies and the last bits of their garden, and that there's uncertainty there. And I wanted to, in that poem, help make space for that and say, not everything is going to be certain, and it's okay that you don't always have that certainty when you want it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is something too, like going back to that poem, I'm So Very Tired, which is not too long before the end of the collection, you know, as if my life is only a meditation on its own end, but then going on to talk about everything else that is in life before it ends, and how, I don't know, there is something about the certainty of death creating a certain urgency and a certain meaning in things, but that when I'm imagining here, okay, so we have these branches that we know are they're going to burn, they're not going to exist anymore, they're going to be ashes. But before they get there, they're going to be a bright blaze. And that seems something really key here as well. I don't know. Does that seem okay to you? Yeah,
absolutely. There's something beautiful being made, and there are people who are taking the time to appreciate it. And that's something that I find I don't do enough of. And so some of that poem was just a reminder to myself that you can be still and want to know for sure what's going to happen, but accept that you don't, and still be able to appreciate what exists at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is as good a place to close our first segment as any. So why don't we take a quick little break and come back and do the second segment?
Sounds good.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you want to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I want to talk about doing something you're not good at.
Okay.
So I've got a story for you to get us started if you want to hear it. Okay. So as an adult, I've kind of structured my life around two things. I've been a writer and I've been a runner. So I don't dabble in any other hobbies. I don't do anything else. I do those two things. And especially with the running, it's really how I've structured my whole schedule. You know I do this run on this day, and I'm going to need an hour and a half on Saturday. And I got injured this summer and couldn't run, had to cut way back, and had to figure out what am I going to do? So I decided I was going to take up swimming, but I'm not great at it. So what I decided I wanted to do was learn to flip turn. So the place that gives my kids swimming lessons, I asked them if they give me swimming lessons, and they did. And I kind of learned to flip turn, but it's really hard. So it's just interesting to me. I think as an adult, I haven't had that many opportunities to learn a completely new skill, and haven't had that many opportunities to experience something that I'm not very good at that I keep working at. Because it's really easy, I think, to try something and not be good at it and say, I'm going to give up on it. So I'm curious if you have much experience with doing something you're not good at, and how it feels to do something you're not good at.
You know what I think is a really key thing here is that there's kind of a difference between some things I can try and I'm not good at them, but I can tell that if I keep going at it, that I'll get better at it. Maybe I won't necessarily be great at it, but I don't know, I'll see some improvement. And then there are some things where I just feel stupid. Like for example, this was a long time ago at this point. This was maybe 10 or 12 years ago. The company that I work for brought in a language tutor because we were going to be interfacing with engineers from China. And so they brought in, we had a twice a week class to try and teach us the basics of Mandarin. And I'm a person who I think of myself as being having a good facility with language. Not that I can speak a lot of languages or anything, but that if I put my mind to it, if I go to a country and, that I'll be able to at least pick up some phrases and talk to a waiter and stuff like that. And not only was I not doing well in that class, but I was doing worse than everybody else in the class too. And I just felt like, I don't even know what I'm doing wrong here. And, if you're kind of used to operating at a fairly high level, that can be kind of dispiriting, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good example of what you were talking about.
No, that's a great example. So were you motivated to keep at it, or did you just want to was it so dispiriting that you wanted to be done with it?
I'm interested in it. I did not keep up with, I continued going to the class it was a 12-week class, and I finished it out, but I haven't actually continued studying it. And part of that is just not having a ton of time. Mm-hmm. I do find it interesting. I have a bunch of coworkers that work in the office with me who are from China. And so they, when they're talking to each other, sometimes they'll be speaking in Mandarin. And it is sort of an interesting experience to be able to pick out a word here and there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did not actually, it wasn't something that necessarily made me want to give up, but it also wasn't something I felt strongly pulled to continue, whereas something like another language like Japanese, for example, which is a sort of, that's the language of my ancestors, but not one that I or my parents or grandparents speak. And I sort of dabble in learning that language. I'm not very good at it, but it is something where I find that when I can make even small progress at it, it is very motivating to continue,
Like progress is interesting too, because one thing I was thinking about is how much of what activities we stick with, how much of that decision is tied to how productive we're being. And productive can be interpreted in different ways. Like, are we making something, or are we achieving something, or are we seeing gains from it? Because I think like people love to be productive because it feels, we want to accomplish things, right? We want to see that we've made something worthwhile.
New Englander kind of thing to say.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
I don't know if everybody feels that way, but I'm there with you. I get you.
And then, like you were saying, with Japanese, where you have that personal connection, feels more motivating to you. So what kind of factors go into making us feel like an endeavor is worthwhile or not? Because I was thinking about things I've not been good at in my life and haven't cared about. So, pre-calculus in high school, I was pretty bad at it, and it did not bother me a bit. Even though I generally cared about being a good student, I wasn't very good at pre-calculus, and that didn't matter to me because I didn't value it. Sorry, Mr. Puritan, but I didn't. So like, we make all kinds of choices about what's worth our time and what's not. And I don't know. So, okay. So photography, were you always good at it? And I know that not everyone, like everyone has to start at the beginning, but did you have an aptitude for it from the start?
I would say that it's an open question as to whether I have an aptitude for it now. A little bit, I'm just joking. Like I do think that I have a certain amount of technical skill and that sort of thing. I would say that, well, one, photography is an exceptionally easy skill to learn. As visual arts go, it is by far the easiest to learn. You can become a pretty competent technical photographer in 6 months. I don't think you can be a competent painter in 6 months,
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about that. Okay. So the technical part of it. Okay.
The technical part is most people, in my experience, even with a relatively basic manual camera, most people can become baseline competent in the technique of photography pretty quickly. What's hard about photography is having anything like an artistic vision. Mm-hmm. And that is something where I'm not always sure that I'm any good at it. I feel like there are things about it that photography is an interesting thing because it's something that I do very automatically, as opposed to every other kind of creative work is something that I have to labor over. Mm. So if you ask me if I have an aptitude for it, if an aptitude means that it's something that kind of can be easily integrated into my consciousness, then yeah, I guess I do have an aptitude for it. But if you mean like, am I achieving something at a high level? Well, I mean, who knows?
I think with the swimming, in part, that's why it appealed to me. Even though I'm not very good at it yet, I can very easily measure, am I getting better? Like I wear my watch and I see if that lap was faster than the lap last week. But yeah, with artistic pursuit, is it good? I don't know. So yeah, it's reassuring. It's reassuring to have a thing that you can do and say, yes, that was better than last time.
Yeah. Yeah. There and swimming and really that kind of like fitness kind of stuff or sports kind of stuff can be so quantitative, whether you're being fast or whether your endurance is growing, when you first are able to swim, 500 meters, then that's a big accomplishment. When maybe you struggle to get all the way across the pool the first time. Mm-hmm. Same thing with running, when you hit a mile, when you hit a 5K, you hit a 10K, those are, it's obvious when you hit that.
Right.
Yeah. What do you like about running so much?
Well, when you were saying that, I was thinking, yes, that was what it was. So when I got very serious about running, it was when I was working as a writer for an agency that closed, and I decided I would freelance, and it felt very scary. And I thought, like, I need some structure in my life. I need something that I can count on. And so it felt very reassuring to know that even though I wasn't sure what my work life was going to be like, I knew, like, on Monday I was going to run 4 miles, and Thursday I was going to do a track workout. And yeah, I liked when a lot of life did not feel quantifiable, to have that one thing that it was going to be metrics and time, and I could just count on that.
Do you think that there is also, because both with running and with swimming, it's not just that the results are quantifiable, but also that the way to get better at it. I mean, it's not that there's only one way to get better at it, but that you can actually go look up advice on how to become a better distance runner or how to become a better distance swimmer. And you can, I mean, there are books that you can, read about. You can go to school for becoming a better artist or a writer or something like that. But it's, at the end of the day, because art is such a particular and personal means of expression, there's kind of nothing that, I mean, you can learn techniques, but in order to become a good artist, it has to transcend the technique on some level. And you have to, at the end of the day, your mentor, your art mentor is just going to say, you got to kind of figure out what you want to do, That's hard.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but yeah, you're right. There's, like, getting better at running is formulaic for the most part. I mean, people have different approaches to it, but if you run this distance at this pace and then you run it a few seconds a mile faster next time, you're going to get better at it. And you just follow the formula, and it feels reassuring. And yeah, you're right. Like, you can work on craft, you can work on technique with your writing, but there's not quite the same kind of established path for it. Yeah. And that's scary.
I think that the other thing too is, if I'm not good at something right away, but it is something that where I have some goal in mind, when I started off as a podcaster, I was not very competent at either the production side of things because I'd never done it before. And I was not if you go back and listen to some of the early episodes, which I don't super recommend doing, it took me a while to sort of figure out what kind of a conversationalist I am and how to go about preparing for a recording session. But I had in mind, like, this is something that I want to do. There's something exciting about it. And that really provides a lot of motivation to get better at it. I don't know if I had any aptitude for it at the beginning. I know that I felt very out of my depth at the beginning.
So let me ask you this, because when you're thinking about your earliest podcast not being up to your
this is
current
maybe
standards.
The first time I've ever been interviewed on my own show.
So what I'm wondering about is, does it bother you to have those early recordings out there that you're not quite satisfied with? Because sometimes when I think about my early work that was published, I kind of cringe. And I recently just read this biography of Jane Kenyon, and it was publishing some of her stuff from, like, when she was in middle school. And I was thinking, like, oh, I hope no one ever does. It's like, oh, it's terrible, Poor Jane.
Wow. Oh, oh, when I die, I'm going to have to definitely make sure that my kids erase my hard drive because
Right, yes.
I've got some poems from high school on my computer and oof.
Yes, I hear you.
There's something about having that stuff out there that is maybe, it's not that I'm not proud of it. I'm proud of it for what it is, you know? And I think that there, even in the very first, 2 or 3 episodes that I did of this show, I think that there's something, if I'm not very skillful at shaping a conversation, and if I'm not very skillful at, producing the audio, there is still something that the core of it where it's reaching towards something and that there is some kind of connection being made there. And so seeing that, even if it's not how I would do it now, I think that there is some value to that. It also feels just more honest to leave it out there, but I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about things like that?
I think that's a lovely way to look at it, that you value having done that work and made that connection. Because that's so much of what we're just trying to make connections, right? When we write poems or we make podcasts or we take photos, like we're just trying to connect with other people. And like, how generous of you to do that and to leave all that early material up there, even if it isn't quite at the standard of what you're doing now. I think that's great. I love that.
Well, what do you find, you just said, some of your old writing, you're kind of, even the stuff that you've had published, there's a little bit of a cringe to it. But what is it? Where does that come from? What is that cringe?
Sometimes it feels, sometimes it's just craft. Like, I think I would have said that differently. That feels kind of trite. So sometimes it's on that level. Sometimes it feels, in hindsight, I can see like I hadn't thought through all the angles, or I didn't know what I know now, and I wish I had. And I guess that's just being human too, right? Like we always look through the lens of experience and think like, oh, if I just understood that, then yeah. Sometimes I'm just like a little bit embarrassed for my earnest younger self. And probably, I think about that too, like with writing a book right now, when I've, just kind of finished putting it together and putting it out there, I feel like, yes, I did that exactly the way I wanted to do. And I also know in 3 years, I'll read this and I'll think like, oh, I should have done that a little differently. It's just, we can't help it. We're always revising ourselves, I think.
Yeah. Something I think a lot about when it comes to just the experience of being a human being, how we are all going through it for the first time. And so there is sort of this inherent learning process that like, we're not going to be good at it,
right? Yep.
Even when you get to the stage of life that we're at, if we're lucky, we can call it middle age, like there's still stuff that I'm certainly not good at. And maybe I'm better at it than I used to be, with a lot of experience and support and a lot of therapy. But, there's still a lot of stuff that I'm bad at. And that I can see how much room there still is left for improvement. And I guess I feel like that's how it is when we're revisiting our old creative work, because our creative work, at least not everybody is like this, but at the very least, the people that I tend to like to talk to on this show, that the creative work is expressive of something about our inner workings, whether those are our feelings or our thoughts. And maybe it's less that we're cringing at the lack of skill and more that we're cringing at like being bad at life. When we were younger, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so like maybe this is a reframing exercise for me. Maybe rather than cringing, I just need to say to myself, that's who you were then, but there's always room to grow and change, and you'll keep doing that.
Yeah, there's a Nietzsche quotation that I don't have the exact quotation, and also for the most part, I find like when I did read Nietzsche in college, my main takeaway was like, this guy's an asshole. But there was a just sort of like almost like an aside in Beyond Good and Evil where he's saying that there is this thing that happens in your life where you look back at your younger self and you just like rail at how young and stupid you were. And then 10 years go by from that point and you look back on your railing at your younger self and you realize, oh, that was me being young too.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess even an asshole has something to...
That's right. Once in a while.
All right. Well, so the last question that I always like to wrap up with is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah, so I've got a 2-for-1 on this one. So the first part of the answer is that I've really gotten interested in the quilts of Gee's Bend. So it's this community of Black women quilters in rural Alabama. And for generations, they've been making these beautiful quilts. They're geometric and they use color in really interesting ways. And historically, this has been an under-resourced community. So they're doing it with the materials that are available to them. And so I find something really moving about the utility and beauty, being in the same thing. So people who care enough to make a household item also artful. I love that. I think it's just beautiful. So I love those quilts. I love looking at them. And then this is the second answer is I loved watching this documentary. So it's a very short film. It's like 15 minutes. It's called While I Yet Live. It's by Maris Curran. And you can stream it on the New York Times YouTube page, but it's just a portrait of some of these women who live in this community and quilt. And it's so interesting to hear them talk about how they learned to do it and what the work means to them. And then it's fascinating just to watch them. So like, I love that, the intricacy of the work and seeing how they put things together. So it's a really, really beautiful film that I highly recommend.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to check that out. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Abbie.
Yeah, this was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Certain Shelter, as well as to Abbie's website and events page. She has a reading coming up at the South Portland Public Library on March 25th, so do check that out. And don't forget that Patreon subscribers at the $2 level can hear Abbie read her poem, I've Learned to Accept, which we mentioned in our conversation. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Boddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you get your podcasts. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back soon with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.